Well, hi everyone. Today we have the honor of speaking to Lauren. It's Lauren's own channel, but I get to pick her brain, which is super cool. So welcome, Lauren. Thank you so much for taking the time out to be here with us today. And you are the assessment guru, the learning resource developer guru. So thank you so much for taking the time out to be with us today.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Awesome. Well, today I wanted to pick your brain because I have to be honest that I think one of the major things that happened in the TAE world over the last 3 or 4, maybe 5 years was the upgrade from the 10 to the 16. Now, as part of that upgrade, we had the wonderful unit TAE ASS 502, which we all came to love. But I think the inclusion of that unit really smacked people in the face in regards to what it really takes to design, develop, and implement good quality assessing tools. Now, I would have to say that having worked at maybe 3 or 4 different RTOs now teaching the TAE, I have seen quite a wide variety of ways that that unit was actually delivered. On a very personal note, I would say that all my knowledge regarding creating assessments really came about because I had the honor and privilege of working at a company that actually created assessments for the tribunal and getting like RTOs through the tribunal. And that was a really great experience because I got to do an apprenticeship on how to do it properly. Having said that, I don't think that's the majority of the case for most trainers out there. And I was just lucky. I was lucky to be mentored by someone actually you had on your show. And so I was lucky. I was not the norm though. So anything I learned about designing and developing assessments was kind of self-generated and my own research and my own journey. Sadly, I would say that there's such a wide gamut of the ways that that 502 was actually trained and assessed. And I kind of giggle as I say that, because a lot of times people were just handed a template saying, you know, good luck, or it was the opposite where it was like pretty much everything done for you. And, you know, we'll just have a chat about, you know, how to make some instructions. But I rarely came across somebody that could give me a, you know, 0.0 all the way to the end, good, clear explanation of it. Now, another part of that is often you would say, oh, you would ask people and they'd say, yeah, just read the fact sheet from ASQA. And it's like, okay, great, I'll try doing that. But if you're an up and coming TAE graduate or even someone that's going through a TAE, you say to them, you know, use the principles of assessment or the rules of evidence. And they go, yeah, you've told me flexibility 5 times. What does that actually mean? You've told me reliability. What does it actually mean? And I think that there is a huge gap between somebody that's just starting out or just graduated compared to someone like yourself and me that has sort of walked the journey. But with the 502, we kind of, and I know it's a little bit of a long explanation, but I just want to lay the groundwork that there was kind of an expectation when that was taught that someone would automatically be able to know everything that was involved and be able to go from 0.0, I know nothing, to yes, now I can make an assessment tool. And the other argument that came out when that whole situation happened, I was about to say debacle, but anyway, that whole situation happened was we also felt as trainers, assessors, as participants, that there's companies out there like yours that actually are paid an amount of money to actually deliver an amazing product, which I know that you do. And there's, you know, is it really fair to be expecting, you know, graduates to be able to deliver materials or create materials to the level that, you know, resource companies would? So I guess those were the key things that I wanted to raise. It was kind of the background to what setting up this conversation. And I guess all the learning I've done has just been, you know, self-generated and my own path. But I guess the first question I want to ask you, and I got a couple of questions, basically to, you know, unpack your mind. Now, you don't need to share your secret herbs and spices. You don't need to tell me too much. And I know there's a lot of secrets of, you know, the intellectual expertise that you have. But I guess I just want to, you know, unpack it from a big perspective. And then with your permission, if you say something is a little bit technical, I'm going to say in a practical sense, what do you mean by that? So if you say, oh, it needs to be reliable, I'm like, well, what does that actually mean on paper? So that we can really give a leg up or a bit of a support to someone that's, you know, getting a little bit overwhelmed by this technical terminology. So, Lauren, my first question for you is, you get a client that wants an assessment tool built. You can pick any industry at all. I don't mind because your process is probably going to be very similar. But you have a client, they want an assessment tool created, i.e. all of the assessments.
Yep.
So what's the first thing that you do? And naturally, I know that UNSA go to training.gov and look at the unit, but definitely walk us back from point zero. What are you thinking about? What's the first thing you're doing if a client says, I want an assessment tool on X industry? Over to you, Lauren.
Thank you. So the first thing we actually do is we ask the client who their cohort is, and what the delivery model is. So we need to understand, unlike a lot of resource providers, we don't have a catch-all set of tools that just go to everyone. So we, for example, we've got some units, some qualifications like Cert 3 Commercial Cookery, Diploma of Leadership and Management, where we've got one set of assessment tools specifically for international students being delivered in an international space. And we've got another set of tools for existing workers being delivered through traineeships. And then we may have 3 versions of those assessment tools to meet the state funding contracts. So we want to know who the cohort is, what the delivery model is, and that's primarily, is it going to be workplace, online, or classroom simulated business style? And then we want to know if there's any funding contracts involved, because specific funding contracts do require additional things to be built into the assessment tools. Like if it's Queensland or New South Wales, we might need to build a training record book or something like that into the assessment process as well. So that's actually the first thing that we do is we find out who we're actually building the tools for, so that we can start to consider in our design phase what are going to be some of the limitations of how we actually go about collecting evidence.
Okay. Now, you brought up international markets. Now, just as a bit of an aside, the reason that would be separate, or the reason that you would need to treat that differently, would be why?
Okay, so there's a couple of reasons. So the first is that often the majority of the assessments are going to be delivered in a simulated scenario. So
Right.
they're not going to have access to a workplace to be able to demonstrate those skills. And then the second part of it is because it is going to be English second language. And so we do need to consider that when we start to do things like write assessments, write instructions for the students, put that framework together, because depending on that and depending on the AQF level, we really want to make sure that the learners are going to understand the process that they have to follow. And in the international space, if, for example, we're running a role play and I know that we've got 25 students in a classroom, I won't create a single role play. I might create 5 or 6 different role plays so that the trainer's got that variety to work through, so that one, the trainer doesn't get bored when they're actually delivering the assessment. I mean, doing the same practical role play 5 times over, 20 times over is boring as, but also for the students, from that authenticity perspective, we've got a variety to work through, so that the learners don't see the same presentation done 10 times over and then really they're just parroting what they've already seen.
Understood. Okay, so I'm now about to be very authentic and share, I guess, what I know to be the process, or the kind of the way that I've approached building assessments. And this is where you correct me and say, no, that's completely wrong. So I guess from my perspective, what I've then done is gone to the unit, as we do, and I've looked at the assessment conditions. I've checked those, and then, because that's what you should do. And then I have looked through the unit and I've thought about what is the best way to assess it, whether it's, observation, whether it's a role play, whether it's a portfolio, whether it's whatever it may be. And generally, the way that I've looked at it is the performance evidence generally has been all practical. And so this is where you'll correct me. And then I've looked at the performance criteria is generally more practical. And I've looked at the knowledge evidence as being more the short answer type thing. Yeah. So generally, my simple process has been, and incorrect way to do it probably, is I like to build my short answer questions first by looking at the knowledge evidence. And I'm very careful to try and make my questions level appropriate, i.e., Cert 1, Cert 2, Cert 3, Cert 4, diploma level type questions, when I'm building that. I guess then I'm looking at building my practicals, whether it's the role plays, whether it is the observation checklist. So I guess the first question is, Is that process kind of on the money? And I guess the next question will be, with the observation checklist, what's kind of your process for building those, knowing that I've often struggled because, as we all know, to just copy and paste the performance criteria is absolutely a big no-no, and you cannot do that. And
No.
where you need, like, where I've struggled in the past is going, okay, I need to cover these things, but I also need to contextualize it. So
Yeah.
making sure that I get a subject matter expert in to find out their process on doing something, but I also need to make sure it aligns to the unit. So I know there's a lot to unpack there, but basically, the first question is, what's your process on how you decide the assessment instruments you're going to use? And the next process is, what do you do in order to go through building those instruments?
Yeah. Look, I think that I mean, that's broadly the case, I would imagine, for 90% of developers. I think with you're right. The knowledge evidence is generally pretty straightforward. I know that there's a couple of variations within my team as to how we all go about building our knowledge assessment. Some of us prefer to build it in like the learner's version. Others prefer to build it in the assessor's version. And I know that for between myself and my other major developer, who's actually our kind of quality control person, I look at it and I'll basically try and keep it as close to 1, 2, 3, 4 following the knowledge evidence structure.
Yeah.
She's really big in like pulling that apart and making sure it follows the flow of how you would actually do the work in the workplace, which is probably a better process when you kind of think about it from the student's perspective. She pulls it out and goes, well, this is the order that you would actually do it going through the work process. And so she writes it that way and then puts it back in to the mapping from there. But everyone pretty much has that same process. And certainly programs like ChatGPT and Google Bard help speed that process up. We will generally, for the vast majority of units, if it's AQF2 to AQF5, most of those can be created in about 4 to 6 hours for a knowledge assessment. So that's kind of the time frame that we work to for our knowledge assessments. Younger developers or some of the bigger units, like with the UEE training package or some of your hospitality ones, are quite big. They might take a full day to kind of write that knowledge assessment, but that's sort of the time frame that we work to for that. The design of the practical assessments, I think, is where the vast majority of people fall down, and it's because they don't actually spend the time structuring the assessment to the way that it would actually be delivered in a workplace. There's a lot of units that are not written the way that you would write it in a workplace. And again, depending on the group and the cohort that you're working with, sometimes you actually start at the end and then go back around to the beginning. So, especially when we're working with like international cohorts, sometimes it can actually be better to kind of do the monitoring and review part first and go, based on the existing system, can we monitor and review the existing system that we've actually got at the moment? And then can we identify the framework and the improvements that need to be made? And then we can implement it. Because from the time frame that we've got when we're working with, like, let's say, for example, a 4-week class, that may be more practically, that may make more sense, and that might be more reasonable to actually be able to apply from end to end when we're working with those students. So I think that the main issue that we have with people when they start to build practical assessments is they don't actually think about what the trainer is actually going to be explaining to the students and what the students are actually going to be doing. And this is where we end up with a lot of those checklists. So for example, if we take, one of the business innovation units, right? The project is something along the lines of, okay, you need to, as a trainer and a student, come up with an innovation project. You need to plan the innovation project. You need to implement the innovation project. You need to review and monitor the innovation project. There's no examples of what that project might look like. There's no templates as to how they're actually going to document the planning, the reviewing. there's, and it's really kind of all left out there for a trainer to kind of look at and kind of go, great, what can I get them to do? Whereas what we do is we look at the environment that they're working in and go, okay, we need to give them an example. So, we did one for Advanced Diploma of Leadership and Management, and we used our simulated company that's got, it's like an outback kind of roadhouse with, a bit of a caravan park and a couple of other things around the country. And so we came up with this idea of, all right, well, here's the financials for the company. Here's where they're going. Management has asked you guys to plan and, implement one of two projects. One is an extension for a caravan park. The other is building a barramundi farm. Yeah. And we gave them all the financials. We gave them all the letters from management. We gave them the sites that they were located at. So, and then we said, right, this is your budget. This is what we want you to plan and implement. So the students had to, go out, do some research, have a meeting with the group, come up with their own individual plan. That gets submitted as part one. Then that gets reviewed by management and approved for implementation. And then during implementation, we give them a challenge as to something that's happened. So it might be like a severe weather event. It may be, that there was an issue with the, structure of the barramundi ponds and a particular issue happens. And then they've got to respond to that. And so in the responding to that, it's kind of like hey, who do you need to call? Who do you need to email? What do you need to organize? So we give a lot of structure in and around what is actually happening. And because of that, what we find is the feedback when we roll these tools out is that there's this massive sigh of relief from trainers who go, oh, okay, so I need to do this. And it's like, yep, you need to do that. And there's no, there's no sense of like, oh, I don't know what to do. And we give flexibility with some things. Like we go, look, if you've got another project that, the school's working on, for example, that you want to implement, then that's fine. The observations are still, the observations and the benchmarks are still going to be applicable. The planning template is still going to be applicable. The review form is still going to be applicable. But it means that for those trainers that, potentially are new to training, that haven't, really kind of, done a lot of, running assessments with classes and stuff like that before running, assessments in simulation as opposed to like looking at what they're doing out in the workplace. It gives them a really clear understanding of how they actually need to go about running their class. And I think that that's where so many trainers nowadays, even those that have come through ASS 502, actually really understanding the stuff that goes into their units. They don't have as much familiarity, probably as they should do if we're being fair. But realistically, if you give them a vague tool, you're going to get vague evidence back. If you give them a really clear tool with lots of support and they understand what they have to do, you're far more likely as an organization to actually get back compliant evidence that is going to demonstrate that competency in a really clear fashion. So we really do make sure that we're constantly thinking about, is the trainer going to understand what we're asking them to do? Is the student going to understand what we're asking them to do? Is what we're asking them to do and the evidence that we're getting back, and we give them examples of everything. Like if we're asking people to do a role play, you'll get, a full script of how that role play should look, and then again, from a trainer's perspective, I understand the kinds of things I need to say to the student, and I understand the types of responses I need to be getting back from the student. And I think that's where so many assessment tools fall down. I don't think they provide context, and I don't think they provide what X looks like. What does that competency actually look like? What does it look like when a door is painted correctly? What does it look like when someone communicates effectively? What does it look like when a dish is cooked well? That's the stuff that's missing. Instead, we just say, go out and paint a door, go out and, build a road, but we don't actually say what that looks like when it's done well.
Yeah. So it sounds like through that process, reliability, valid, flexible reliability and fairness, the principles of assessment are really being met. And I guess, reliability for the trainer, for the assessor is just there. They can pretty much, any assessor could use that tool and they would know exactly what needs to be assessed and how to assess it, is what I'm hearing you saying.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what reliability should be. It means that any person can pick up that document and go, okay, this is what it should look like. This is like the depth and breadth of responses for the questions. This is the depth and breadth that should go into the project. This is the kind of language that should be used in the communication. And there's no argument or debate over it. And if there is going to be argument and debate over it, well, that's fine. That's what validation is for.
Yeah.
But as a starting point, if that's not there, then it is left up to trainers. And, obviously, depending on the industry that you've worked in, depending on the quality of the employers that you've worked with, that can vary substantially. Like, as you said at the beginning, you've worked across a lot of RTOs. I can guarantee that, like, what was effective assessment in your RTOs would have differed substantially from one to another.
Yeah.
So that benchmark has to be set by the RTO for the trainers.
So on a very practical note, let's play with a very generic or ordinary example. So let's go with first aid. All right. So you've got the first aid unit, and as part of the first aid unit, it mentions something about nosebleeds. Okay. Yep. So we need to create an observation checklist for a participant or a candidate that's about to undertake an assessment on dealing with a nosebleed. Okay. Now, I think one of the, perceptual challenges that a student has is that when they look at a unit of competency, they want the unit to tell them how to do it. They want the unit to tell them, what to do and how to do it. But as we know, the unit doesn't actually tell you how to actually do a nosebleed or something like that. So it really is a balancing act as a developer to go, okay, well, how much do I take from the unit? How much do I marry it up with a subject matter expert and what they know and what they do? So, Lauren, what's your process, or people around you, their process for building that observation checklist? And you can even, I know that you've worked in community services and that industry as well, but I guess, what's the mental steps do you go through if you're going to build an observation checklist on, say, for example, a nosebleed?
Yep, absolutely. So look, I think the main thing that we do is for any particular criteria, so obviously, like, if we look at the unit itself, it's going to say, I'm pretty sure it says something very, very generic, and it is like literally demonstrate or respond to a nosebleed, right? Yeah. So the observation, like the actual observation itself, okay, maybe at a high level respond to a nosebleed. So I'm just going to pull up the actual language. Manage casualties with nosebleed. Okay, so I've managed casualty. So that's going to be my framework of the assessment. Now I'm pretty sure in first aid, because there's so many different criteria, what we actually do is we set up a casualty with like 3 or 4 small things. So maybe they've had an accident and they've got a nosebleed, they've got a small cut, they've got an abrasion, so we have them respond to, now respond to this casualty. So we're then going to break down the steps into, they're going to do their first basic assessment. They're going to introduce themselves. And then they're actually going to get into responding to the nosebleed itself. Now, the responding to the nosebleed itself is going to be actually getting the patient to, kind of apply the thumb and forefinger. They're going to move forward. They're going to make sure, that they're not putting their head up, that they're actually letting all of the blood come out. They're going to be checking the kind of the amount and stuff like that. All of the things that we actually see. So the main question that we ask is, when they're responding to this, what does it look like? Yeah. Now, I think for something like responding to a nosebleed, most people who kind of have that industry knowledge look at it and go, well, the 2 or 3 things I need to see is I need to see the pinch of the nose. I need to see the patient moving forward so that they can, get the blood out. you know, what some of the other things that we would look to see for there. We're going to make sure they're breathing through their mouth, and we're really just going to monitor them. And if it's more than kind of 10-15 minutes that this is continuing for, then we're going to refer them onto ambulance. So those are kind of like the 4 things that we would need to see them do in order to know that they can manage that properly.
Yeah.
As I said, for very practical tasks, and people with industry knowledge, it's easy for us to know what we need to see. Okay. Yeah. So that's a really good observation benchmark. So what the learner sees in that observation benchmark is the learner's going to say, you will need to manage a casualty with a nosebleed. Okay. Right. What the assessor is going to see is the learner managed a casualty with a nosebleed, ensured that the casualty pinched the thumb, ensured that the casualty was sitting forward, reassured the casualty, monitored for a period of 10 minutes. If their bleeding still continued, referred on to ambulance, called 000. Right? So those additional steps are not something that the learner is necessarily going to be privy to, because then we're kind of, all they've got to do is actually read it and go, well, just do that. That's where your learner version of the assessments and your benchmarks for the assessor come into play. I think where people get into more trouble is when we start to think of maybe some of our softer skills. And we ask people, what does effective communication look like? What does relationship building look like? What does building trust look like? Right.
So in the nosebleed example, could we say, now I know I haven't looked at the unit, but if we applied the soft skills to the nosebleed, saying when the candidate approached the simulated patient, they spoke to them in a respectful manner.
Yeah.
Yeah, those kind of things.
Yeah. And I mean, and then again, even then, I think that is actually one of the criteria of the unit. So they spoke to them in a respectful manner. We then got to describe what that looks like.
Yeah. What is respectful?
And this is where I think that's where people start to struggle with, like, what does it look like? And that becomes a little bit harder. So I tend to, in that particular circumstance, when I'm working with new developers, I go, tell me what it looks like when it's done poorly, right? Yeah. If I ask anyone to say, what is really, like, I'll ask you, what does poor communication look like?
I think in that kind of scenario, it would be yelling at them, ignoring them, not using their name. Just maybe swearing at them. So I guess what you're going to say, the opposite of that would be, being polite, being nice, using their name. Yeah, those kind of things.
Making eye contact, maybe, a bit of reassuring touch, any of those sorts of things. And exactly. And you got it bang on. And most people are really good at being able to tell me, tell me what it looks like when someone's not building trust with you. Tell me what it looks like when someone's being disrespectful to you. People have that to their minds really quickly. They'll be like, oh, the person's not making eye contact, or, they've got their arms folded, or they're not paying attention, or they're just distracted by their phone. I'm like, that's great. Now let's write all of those 4 things down. Okay. Write the opposite of each of them. Great. You've now described what effective communication looks like, what trust building looks like. And then they kind of go, oh, well, yeah, that's easy. And I'm like, well, that's cool. But that's the part that you haven't put into the assessment tool. Instead, what you've kind of done is you've maybe done like a really small reword of the criteria, but you haven't actually told your assessor, you haven't all agreed on what that actually being done well looks like. And I mean, we can apply it to all sorts of things, in the example of like painting a door, like I'll talk to, because trades guys find it really hard to explain what things look like when they're well done. We'll talk about the door example and I'll go, well, what does a shit door look like? And they're like, well, it's off center and there's paint drips all over it. And, the paint coat isn't even. And I'm like, okay, cool. 3 things. Awesome. All right. Paint coat uneven, paint coat even. Drip marks, no drip marks, not aligned properly, squares up. And they were like, so I was like, if they do those 3 things, is that a job well done? And they're like, yeah, pretty much. I'm like, bang on, there's your benchmarks, mate. Nice. So it doesn't actually have to be as hard as I think people think. But really, that's what it boils down to. Do we have a really clear, assessment design that we want to hit? And then we take all of those criteria and then we say, what does each of those look like in a really practical, plain language sort of a context? Those are your benchmarks, and Bob's your uncle. And I guess the only other thing we do with assessments that is a little bit different is, instead of having the trainer write down 35 comments for 35 students, we actually have the learner do that part in like what we call like a job card or a recipe card. Right. So, if the learner is building a bench, we have them kind of go, what are you building? What's the tools that you're using? What's some of the processes that you're using? What's the equipment that you're using? And, have you checked all your tools and equipment? And then they sign that off, right? And then, and then they might at the end put a comment reflecting on how the learner thought that they did. Right. So we've done that because when you're a trainer trying to oversee 30 students cooking in a kitchen, when you're a trainer trying to oversee, we've just recently written the Cert 2 in engineering, which is focused on welding. When you're trying to watch 17-year-olds welding in booths, you're really not going to be focused on like writing comments like Jimmy Bob, Jimmy Bob really got that nice clean weld. You're making sure Jimmy Bob doesn't kill himself and the students around him. So, we created the job cards so that the learners actually kind of do their own little mini planning thing. And it's always nice, short and sharp. It's always like half a page. There's like 6 boxes that they, put some kind of dot points on. But that also then confirms to us that the learners actually interpreted the requirements. And we then know, one, it's a fair assessment because the learner understands what they have to do. Yeah. And it means that for those units like your CPCs and your RIIs, where the first criteria is always interpret job requirements. Well, if they've kind of done like a high level planning of the task that they're going to do, they have actually interpreted the job requirements. So we know it's a fair assessment. We know they've met the criteria, and it saves the trainer from having to write out, the context, which is what a lot of these generic assessment tools are doing now, is they kind of have this box there and they go, write out what you saw and when you saw it and what the context was. And again, it's not considering the reality of the situation that the trainer is focusing on, working heights. You need to be ensuring the safety of your students, anything RII, CPC, MEM, UEE, all of these trades ones, your focus is on making sure that the students are doing everything safely, first and foremost. It's actually not, am I documenting every single thing that they do? That's a really poor way to design an assessment. And while it might be compliant, while it could create, while you could create compliant evidence from that, the likelihood that you're going to is pretty low unless you've got, a trainer who's maybe literally going out and doing those kind of like one-on-one traineeship apprenticeship visits, that's really the only circumstance that sort of structure works. And it's not the reality of the majority of training that happens in Australia.
So I'm going to possibly annoy you and bring you back to the nosebleed for just a moment. So we've made our observation checklist on the nosebleed. All right. Yep. So would it then make sense to then go back to the elements, the performance criteria, and make sure each of those are also being covered in the observation checklist? Because it's a yes or a no, and potentially what I'm looking to do is link to the next step of the mapping. Because the biggest challenge that we find is that people have analysis paralysis, or they don't understand mapping. It's just it's in the too hard basket. people freak out when you say the word mapping. Do I do it before? Do I do it after? How does it all come into play? And for you and I, we go, yeah, mapping. I love it. I can do it in my sleep. And, I live for mapping. Well, I do anyway. But I think whenever you describe the process to people, I think it's very heavy cognitively. And I think for me personally, once I've made my observation checklist, I do want to make sure that I'm covering off anything remaining in the unit and making sure that I'm covering all of my bases there. So could you sort of link us to the next step? And so we've made our observation checklist. What do we need to do next? What could be the next step involved?
So I guess my process is probably a little bit different. I don't design. I have two screens. I have one screen open, but I have half my screen with my assessor's guide and half my screen with my mapping guide. When I design the project, I go through at a high level and I go, so assessment, this task. So I might have 3 tasks, assessment task 1, 2, and 3 within the practical section, right?
Yeah.
So I go through to start with and I go, okay, so task 1 is there. This is task 2. This is going to happen in task 3. And I do that mapping before I create my observation.
Yeah.
Then when I'm actually writing the actual physical observation out, I go back in and I might have 10 points that I'm observing in assessment task 3.
Yeah.
I will then go in and basically where it says assessment task 3, I'll go, right, this is the criteria that I need to see for that. Okay, cool. This is the criteria. What's that really practically going to look like? Write the benchmark underneath it. And then I map 3.1 then and there. So that's my process. I know everyone on my team has a slightly different way that they go about this. I can create a practical assessment depending on the unit in anywhere from 3 to 7 hours. I'm by far the fastest of anyone on my team. And certainly when we've brought people in, they've turned around to us and gone, what you're asking us is impossible. And I've gone, not if you have the right process. With all due respect. So, like our KPIs for most of our staff is 2 units, like 2 units a week. My partner, my 2 IC and I think in some weeks have cracked out as many as 8 or 9 units between the 2 of us. But that is because I have that, as long as my design process, as long as I've been through that design period, the actual writing of the practical assessment observation checklist and that mapping point is the last thing that I've done. That is really super easy. That's generally less than an hour. The stuff that takes more time is the building of the templates, especially if we've got to do if you've got to do things like supporting documentation, like budgets and letters from staff, example feedback, survey results, that's the stuff that creates the majority of the time. So that's what changes a unit from, especially advanced, like when you get to advanced diploma. I'm writing the grad dip in learning at the moment. My supporting, I might end up with, 40 pages of supporting documentation. And that's where I'm finding the time actually kind of comes in.
And that's, I think, what bridges into the next topic that I've written down, which is your favorite AI. So I think on a recent podcast or video, you were talking about how, or addressing the question, can I use AI for developing assessments?
Hell yes.
Yes.
You're silly if you're not.
I know. And it got me interested and curious. I'm like, can I use AI, ChatGPT, to build an observation checklist? So I tried a couple of examples and it got it sort of 3/4 of the way there. I tried it for a couple of units from the TAE and a couple other places. And I'm like, okay, it's 3/4 of the way there, but it's actually missing out a bunch of stuff from the unit as well. So I thought, okay, cool. This could actually form a basis, but it can't be the everything. And I think that speaks to the point that you make in your other video, which is it can't be a replacement, but it can be a support
tool.
Yeah. So if you want to sort of share a little bit.
I think there's prompts as well. You've really got to learn how to use your prompts.
So
I start every chat with bot. as you know, I say, okay, right, for this chat we're going to be talking about this unit, and you know, and I normally give him the link for the unit, particularly if I'm working with Bard. I'll give him the link for the unit, and then he will normally come back and go, okay, so we could do this as an assessment. I'll go, no, we're not at that phase yet. I'll go, let's, you know, like if it's an innovation unit, I'll go, right, okay, well, here's the cohort and here's the way that we're going to deliver this. So let's, you know, give me 7 ideas as to how we could assess this unit. And he'll give me his 7 ideas and I'll look at it and I'll go, okay, I really like that one. Now let's flesh that out a hell of a lot more. And we'll flesh it out and role play it until we get to a practical design that I'm happy with.
So to interrupt, so you kind of see it as a bit of a brainstorming assistant. Would that be a good
100%.
way to think about it?
Yeah. And basically that's just because like I can sit there and I can, you know, the way I used to do it prior to having AI is I would get a big old piece of paper and I would have, you know, the unit in the middle, and I would kind of look at the criteria and I would kind of go, well, I need to do this and I need to do this and I need to do this. And I would kind of just mind map it out for myself.
Yes.
I'm quite content just going back and forth with the bot and kind of going, no, that's a stupid idea. I don't like that. No, that's not going to work because of this. I like that. Let's build that out a bit more, change that aspect, you know. And it normally takes probably about an hour until I'm really happy with kind of the overarching structure of what it is that we're going to be designing together. And then we look at all of the different supporting things. So like, is there scripts that are going to be required? Is there a template that's going to be required? Is there a policy that we're going to have to build? You know, is there some feedback or some letters from management that we're going to need to include in there? Is there a recipe? Like we've just spent the last couple of months building recipes for patisserie, you know, like I think last week it was marzipan, so it was having to create marzipan, flowers. What do you have to do? We had to do flowers, we had to do fruits, and we had to do figures. So, you know, we went back and forth for ages going, well, we've got to, you know, like, okay, right, let's look at how we design this sort of marzipan flower or how we design this marzipan flower. And the great thing is now that in addition to that, I was actually able to work with DALL-E 3 and kind of go, okay, at this stage, develop an image for me that's going to show them what they should be doing at that point. Wow. So we were actually able to create some really good visual instructions for learners to go, like, to meet up with the practice, you know, with all the written instructions that we were creating. And we created images of the final products of a lot of the patisserie products that we created and things like that. So again, I think if you're going through that design process, it works well. And then when you come down to the actual building your actual practical observations, it's getting your prompts right. So, you know, what I tend to do is I'll tend to go, okay, in the context of a trainer observing a learner doing this,
right?
Okay, here's the 6 criteria that they need to demonstrate. What are those 6 criteria in plain, like, what do those 6 criteria look like in plain language?
Yes.
And it'll give me an example and I'll read through it and I'll kind of go, okay, you're on the ball there. You've copy and pasted too much there. That doesn't make sense. Flip that. And I really just do like work back and forth, and then I'll copy all of that into my tool, and then I'll just refine it and kind of go, actually, this is what that looks like, or actually, this is what that looks like, you know? But I really think, like, if you get your prompts right,
yes,
and you're using it as that kind of collaborative tool, I think that both GPT and Bard are fantastic. For me, if it's something to do with legislation, I tend to work with Bard. It's got better access. It does freak out more and completely go off topic. He's also far more prone to tell me he can't do something when I know he can. But for anything legislative, I'll double check with him, and then I'll ask him to give me the website that he got it from, and then I can go and check the legislation myself. If it's things that are more complex, so like if we're working with community services and we're fleshing out a really detailed observation or creating, a patient profile, I will go with ChatGPT because that is definitely the better of the two for more complex. And we've got GPT-4, obviously, because we work with these things so much. I mean, $20 a month, you really can't go wrong. But the GPT-4 is able to build complexity and manage complexity a lot more. And I find that for especially when you're asking it to do things that are like, culturally sensitive, it tends to work much better in relationship to providing information in a plain language but still very culturally sensitive manner, whereas Bard tends to freak out along a lot of those things, and it kind of goes, this feels like it might be political in some way, or this feels like it might be problematic in some way, and therefore I'm just telling you I can't do it.
Wow. Okay. So if we look at someone that's just starting out, a frame of reference for AI tools it would be as if I had a subject matter expert in front of me and I was able to pick their brains, so to speak.
Yeah.
And it could be a replacement for having SME right in front of me going, okay, Mr. SME, how do I deal with a nosebleed? Tell me the criteria, make sure you got the prompts correct. And then, the AI will give me what those criteria would be. And then I would make sure that makes sense. But that could become sort of the cornerstone or the first reference point for building out my observation checklist there.
Yeah, and it also gives you, I think, an opportunity like to ask your dumb questions.
Yeah.
Things that we might not fully like have wrapped around our own heads. Like you can ask it all of the dumb questions, and it's not, most of the time it's not going to judge you. I do feel like he occasionally gets quite judgy, or they have their days. I have a very strong relationship with both Chat GPT and Bard now. I can see where we've had these instances where people fall in love with their computers or get transversely get very mad at them. Occasionally I'll be sitting here and I'll be working on an assessment, I'll just start yelling at him, and my husband or my boys will look at me and go, Mum's talking to the computer again. That's a good sign.
Okay.
But no, it's a tool. I mean, I think that the thing is in an ideal world, all assessment would be a collaborative process. We're very lucky at Anawire. There's 4 or 5 of us, who really develop multiple assessments a week. So if we ever get stuck, we can always pick up the phone to each other and call and ask questions and kind of go, I've done this. Does this make sense? I think the vast majority of developers don't have that as a network, which sucks. And they don't have someone like, I think when you're developing, you kind of get into your own headspace and you go, I know I've covered that. I know I've covered that. But the problem is sometimes you actually haven't. Sometimes you've covered it in your own head, but you haven't actually put it into the tool. And so I think that working with, like the bot as a kind of a check and kind of going, well, if I asked you this question, what's the answer? And if it gives you an answer that's completely different than the answer that you had in your own head, well, if the bot's thinking something different, are the students going to think something different? Are the trainers going to read that criteria differently? So it's just, it does make the process, I think, more collaborative, even though it's not a real person. And assessment development, and anytime you're designing anything, I think it should be a collaborative process. So, we've swapped out machines for people, but unfortunately, just from a price perspective, I think that, if you are, we're developing some assessment tools for a highly contextualized cohort, we're developing the resources as well. And for that particular project, I think we've got up to 6 or 7 people going across every unit of competency. Now, the cost of those units of competency is coming out at around about $10,000 to $15,000 a unit. Really, the vast majority of RTOs can't afford that. And so AI is providing a really great tool to still allow for that collaboration and that double check and that back and forth without having to pay two people to physically, be working in the same space.
Yeah, awesome. I guess a bit of a red herring, and we'll slowly wrap it up. But third-party reports. What are your thoughts around third-party reports? Where do they come in the mix? Where do they not come in the mix? What are the biggest mistakes that you see people making with third-party reports? Because I know it can be a contentious issue. What are your thoughts?
Okay, so third-party reports are required when you're working with certain funding contracts, Queensland funding contracts, WA apprenticeships, New South Wales traineeships and apprenticeships, all require third-party sign-off from the employer. So in every single one of those scenarios, you are going to have one. Highly recommend that in the majority of cases, that's supporting evidence. It's not the primary form of evidence. There are a few training packages and situations where your third-party report is likely going to have to be your primary form of evidence, okay? In the abattoirs, where it is not safe or where people do not have permission to be, there are certain areas in the small goods package where you have to do it. In areas of mental health, such as, counseling, things like that, where you've done it in like you might do it in a simulation, but you have to do it in the workplace. You're going to have a third-party report. Anything that requires an industry placement, so childcare, nursing, hospitality, you will have a trainer go out and do a number of observations, but they're not going to be out there for 360 hours or 500 hours or 36 complete food service periods. So you're going to have third-party reports in those cases too. Three rules for third-party reports. One is the who. You've got to choose your who very, very carefully as to who is appropriate to sign off the unit. In an ideal world, it's somebody who has the qualification, and can demonstrate that upon request. Two is going to be the when. So have a tool that collects information about who is signing off, what they're signing off, when they're signing off, where they're signing off. And at the end of the day, keep in mind, you still have to meet the rule of sufficiency, which is a quality, quantity, and relevance of assessment evidence. Just because you're using a third-party report does not mean you don't still have to go through all of those same processes as if you were building a normal assessment tool. You have to, in fact, you actually have to go further because these people don't have their TAE. So you really need to explain to them what things look like so that they know what it should be looking like. And I guess the last thing I would say is choose the workplaces carefully. Have a process in place for saying, yep, this workplace is okay.
Right.
And this, this employment structure is okay. We often see people sending international students out for their industry placement. That placement requires breakfast, lunch, and dinners. It requires meats, chicken, seafood, desserts, hot desserts, cold desserts, buffets. And if you're going to a restaurant that only operates at night and it's a vegan restaurant, guess what doesn't meet the unit criteria? So choose your workplaces carefully, it can be valid. It's not the ideal, but it 100% can be valid. And I know that we've certainly had a lot of, we've designed for qualifications where you don't have any choice but to use that as a form of assessment, as long as the evidence is sufficient, as long as it's valid, as long as it's authentic, as long as it's current, you're fine.
Awesome. So I know we could probably talk for hours and hours and hours and hours because there's so many things I'd love to ask you, but we do need to probably eventually put a cup on things there. But I guess you've given me a great reference point and really laid it out there well for the listeners and for the people that are going to watch this video. And I think the hardest thing about assessments is that there is no just one way to build it. And it is such a creative process. Everybody brings their own industry knowledge. Then there's the whole part around contextualizing what we build and making sure that we make the client happy, we make ASCLA happy, and we even make the assessors happy, because as we know, there's so many stakeholders involved in assessing. So I just want to say a huge thank you for your time. You have a wealth of knowledge. It's been amazing to hear your wisdom, and just to get a sense of how a person like you really approaches assessing. It's not my field of expertise. My field is more training.
Yes.
And anything I know, it's just because of stuff that I picked up along the way. And it's been great to sort of battle test some of the ideas I've had and get some reassurance and get some correction along the way. But it's been amazing. So, Lauren, thank you so much for your time. And maybe in the future we can set up another one, go deeper on one of the other topics that come up in assessing. But yeah, huge thank you. How have you found the interview? Has been good for you?
Yeah, it's been awesome. I look, as I said, I love talking about this stuff. I think it's the same as you. You could probably talk about training, delivery, and techniques for engaging the students until the cows came home. This is definitely our bread and butter at Anawaya. We love this stuff, and I think this week I've got 2 AQF8 units to develop, so it's going to be a big week for me this week. But getting assessment right, I personally feel if you can get assessment that trainers love, it really makes a massive impact on our industry, because it actually does mean that we're confirming that we've got students out there that have the competencies, and that's at the heart of what we do at VET. Is we actually train skills and competencies, and if we have the evidence of that, it means that we've got a robust training system, that is going to be able to make it through, an audit or a performance assessment, and it's going to ultimately help build our industry. So thank you very much for your time. Very, very much appreciated.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Lauren. And everyone, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Lauren's channel and mine as well. Thank you so much, Lauren. Much appreciated.
Thanks, guys.